What's going on, young people? Thank you for joining me for our second lecture from Unit 9 about social psychology. In the last one we talked about attribution, and in this video we're going to be talking about attitude. How attitudes are formed and how they can be changed, all right? That's the discussion for today. So we're going to have 4 sections of notes. I'm going to start off with a story about an experiment, a psychological study. In the 1930s, a researcher named Richard LaPierre traveled through California with a Chinese couple. At that time in the United States, there were many stories in the media about how prejudiced people were against Chinese people. LaPierre was worried that they would have problems finding restaurants and hotels to visit because of his friends. They were pleasantly surprised to find that of the 128 restaurants and hotels, that's a serious trip, they visited, all but one served them courteously. They were kind. The researchers thought that maybe the newspapers had exaggerated people's negative attitudes towards Chinese people. So what he did to experiment was, after their trip, he sent a questionnaire to all the places they had visited, and he asked them, would you accept members of the Chinese race in your establishment? That's the wording that he used a long time ago. They could say yes, no, depends upon the circumstances. So what do you think they said? All right, almost all of them, all but one, had let these folks in, been kind, been helpful. What do you think they said when asked? It's interesting. 90% of these establishments said that they would not accept members of the Chinese race. And the other 10% either said they would or maybe said it depends upon the circumstances. But 90% of these hotels and restaurants that had been incredibly kind to this group said they would not allow it. It's really interesting. Here's what I want y'all to write. And this is kind of the first slide here about LaPierre, the researcher, and what he said about attitude. His study shows that knowing someone's attitude, knowing the way they think, does not always predict how they're going to behave, right? These folks had racist attitudes. They made that very clear. They put it in writing and sent it off for the study. Yes, they were racist. But yet, they did not act in a racist way when people actually showed up at their door. Why might this be? Why might these folks in these hotels and restaurants who did not want Chinese people in their establishment, why were they so kind to this couple? Okay, you might have some theories as to why this is, right? Some folks say, well, maybe they just couldn't get up the nerve to actually be racist in person, or you might say maybe it's because that the people they were traveling with, the fact they were with a professor, maybe that made a difference, right? This idea that people can change their behaviors based on the specific situation, this is called self-monitoring. It's the idea that you might act differently in certain situations. Let me give you an example. You probably don't talk the same and act the same when you're with your friends, when you're with your team, when you're in class, and when you're with your grandparents, okay? The words you use, the language you use, it might be a little bit different depending on who you're with, okay? If you often will change and shift who you are, we would call you a high self-monitor. You are aware about your situation and how you maybe should act differently with different people, and you can switch. If you've heard the term code switching, this is a term used to describe high self-monitors. They can switch back and forth between multiple personas. Low self-monitors, in contrast, low self-monitors, they do not act differently based on their situation. Low self-monitors pretty much always act the same. Is that good or bad? Oh, it kind of depends, right? There's some good things about that, right? Being consistent, knowing what's expected, and just having that regularity, that's a good thing to be a low self-monitor. But there's also times in life where we need to be able to adjust and adapt based on our surroundings. So self-monitoring is how people might be able to act in ways that are different or inconsistent than maybe their beliefs because of their situation. Okay? So question for y'all. Which quote do you like better? Do you think is more true? That someone's attitude is going to predict their behavior, or that if we look at someone's behavior, that predicts their attitude? We'll talk about that in class. And then a little review from our last homework. When you make the fundamental attribution error, do you remember? Is that internal, external, situational, dispositional? Is that stable or unstable? How are you explaining their behavior? Okay? Make sure that you can answer that. Second point for today is about an idea called cognitive dissonance. And if you will, put a star by this point. It's a really important concept that they're definitely going to ask you about in the AP exam, and it'll be on the test next week. So the guy who came up with this is Leon Festinger. okay? Festinger. And cognitive dissonance, it's a painful thing. It's a bad thing. Dissonance is a tension, all right? The idea here is that you have multiple things in your mind, maybe an attitude and a thought, or maybe an attitude and an action, but something doesn't line up, okay? It's causing problems for you. Are you familiar with the word for something to fester? Okay? Like a festering wound is something that is bad, it's painful, it's hurting, it's causing problems. When I see this name Festinger, I think about the word fester, something that's causing problems. Also, his name contains these letters, G-I-N-T, T-I-N-G, G-N-I-T, cognitive dissonance, Festinger. I don't know. For me, seeing those like overlaps in letters helped me remember who did what. Okay. So here's what happened. He said that sometimes we have these two thoughts in our mind, or a thought and a belief, or a thought and an attitude, or an action and a belief, and they don't match up. And we don't like that feeling that we're being inconsistent. So what Festinger said is that we will resolve dissonance by changing our thinking. Let me give you an example. If you buy something, let's say you buy a new pair of shoes, that cost you $120, and you put them on, and you start to think to yourself, oh no, these don't look that good. That's cognitive dissonance. You spent $120, but they don't look that good? That's a problem. That's dissonant. That's going to cause tension in your mind. So, you got two options. One, you could try and go return these to the store, right? That's the way that you could resolve your dissonance. So you get in your car, you drive to the mall, you show up at the store, you try to return, they're like, oh, sorry, you can't return these, it looks like you've worn them, you don't have the receipt, a week has gone past, you can't return these. Now you're stuck with the shoes. You spent $120 on them, you don't like them very much, how can you resolve this dissonance? What Festinger said is that we convince ourselves, we change our thinking, we convince ourselves, you know what? Actually, these shoes don't look that bad. If I wear them with this outfit, if I wear them to this event, actually, I like the shoes. You convince yourself. It's hard to go through life acknowledging that you made a mistake, that you spent money and the shoes are no good. So instead, you convince yourself that it's actually worth it. Okay, this is really interesting. He developed his theory by studying a cult. They called themselves the Seekers. This was in the 1950s. And they believed that the world was going to end in 1954. So they sold everything they owned, and they would just go out and tell people the world's going to end in 1954. Come join our religious group, all right? Guess what happened? The world didn't end in 1954. It is too painful to just admit that you've been wrong, especially when you've sold all your things and you've done all this work. So what Festinger said and what he found this group did is they didn't admit they were wrong. Instead, they sort of changed their thinking. They said because they had been so devout, God called off the planned apocalypse. They did not completely get rid of their beliefs. Instead, they just kind of changed them a little bit so that their actions were purposeful and made sense and happened for a good reason. That's what cognitive dissonance is. We change our thinking. Here's another example. And he wrote this a long time ago. Someone who smokes, they know it's bad for their health, but they might claim, here's some things that smokers might say. They like it so much that it's worth it, right? The good outweighs the bad. They might say yeah, it's bad, but the chances of me having a problem aren't that serious. I'm probably going to be fine. They might say, you can't avoid every possible dangerous situation. That's no way to live. Or they might say, you know what, if I stop smoking, that would cause me to gain weight, and that would be bad for my health, so I might as well smoke. They convince themselves, and this is true for smoking. You can also say, y'all know people who vape, who use e-cigarettes still? They probably know it's bad for them, but they convince themselves, it's worth it, or it's not that bad for me, or you gotta live a little, or if I didn't do this, I'd fall asleep in class all the time, or I'd have all these other issues, so it's worth it. They convince themselves that it's worth it. This is Festinger's whole idea that sometimes instead of living a different kind of life, we just change our thinking, and that's easier. That's cognitive dissonance. So think to yourself, how might a college student, they want to be a doctor, they fail biology class, this is going to cause dissonance, right? They want to be a doctor, they failed biology, and they're having to drop out of the pre-med program. What might they do to resolve this dissonance? Question 2, I have a theory that seniors, towards the end of second semester, they start acting like they hate linear high school. Something in their brain switches. Why might this be the result of cognitive dissonance? And number 3, Why might people become more tied to a political candidate who has lost or who's in a scandal? Why might they become more committed to that person because of cognitive dissonance? We'll talk about this in class, but I feel like cognitive dissonance explains a lot about our world today. Right? Our brain wants things to match up, and we can convince ourselves that things are true or that things make sense, even if they really might not. Right? Our brain's really good at tricking ourselves. So let's talk now about switching ourselves to how we can persuade other people. Right? So you've learned in language arts class probably there are a few different ways to try and persuade someone. Right? If you're writing a persuasive essay, there are a few different strategies and techniques, okay? And I want to talk about the two main routes, the two different types of persuasion. If somebody is motivated to listen to your argument, they care deeply about the issue, and they have time, all right? You should use what's called the central route to persuasion. I think in language arts class I'll call this logos. It's using logic. It's using data, okay? You develop a clear argument, you have supporting details, you have good points, you share it with them, you take the time to convince them, and eventually they might come around to your perspective because of your data, because of your facts. The central route. It's the direct route. You say, hey, I want to persuade you, I want to convince you, here's why I think this is what you should believe, what you should think, what you should do. Sometimes your audience does not have that much time, they don't care that much about the issue. And in that case, instead of using the central route with logic, you should use what's called the peripheral route. Remember, peripheral means off to the side. Your peripheral vision with those rods, it's your vision off to the side. Throwback from Unit 3. Peripheral route, it's a sneaky route. They don't have time to actually process your whole argument, so instead, you should appeal to their emotions. It's more important that they like you, or that you try to convince them using somebody that they like, right? If they love John Legend, instead of convincing them to go to Penn by providing the data, the cost, the class size, the rankings, right? Using the central route, you just say, hey, you know John Legend went to Penn, you should go to Penn. If they don't have that much time to invest in the argument, they will be convinced. It's sort of like an unconscious, they're easily manipulated by shiny things, by emotional appeals, and by who the source is. We call that the peripheral route. So before you try to convince your parents or your teachers of something, think to yourself, how invested are they in this argument, and how much time do they have? If they're super invested and have a lot of time, provide data and facts for them to try and convince them. If they're not super invested and don't have much time, you're trying to convince them to let you go to your friend's house, right? Sometimes better say, Ford's going. Oh, they love Ford. If Ford's going, oh, great, fantastic, you can go. That's you using the peripheral route, right? If you lay out all the information, like, here's what's going to be happening, here's what we're going to be doing, here's our agenda, my Life 360 will be on, just for this time, for this moment, I'll check in with you. That's you trying to use the central route to persuasion. And which route you should use depends on how much time they have, all right? So we'll look at this graphic in class. Basically, it talks about the two different ways to persuade someone, and what it says here is, do people have the ability and the motivation to pay attention? That's what determines what strategy you should use. They have the ability and motivation to pay attention. So let's say that you want to persuade someone of something else. And this is commonly used for people who are like selling things, right? Sales folks, salespeople. You're trying to convince someone of something. Here are a few different things you can do to convince them to change their attitude, to change their mind, to change their thinking. So one concept is called effort justification. The idea here is when something is harder to get, we value that thing more. We like it more. Have y'all heard the expression, someone playing hard to get, like in a romantic relationship? Like, don't make it seem like you're too into them, play hard to get. That's an idea of effort justification, that people value things more if it's been harder to achieve that thing, right? No one wants a certificate of participation that everybody gets. You want that award or trophy that was difficult to obtain, to achieve. Fraternities and sororities, they make it really difficult. They have like a pledge period. It's really difficult. You have to do all these tasks in order to prove that you're part of the group. What they have found is that doing these ridiculous, stupid, sometimes painful tasks, it actually makes you more committed to the group. It's a form of cognitive dissonance, honestly. It's like you're convincing yourself, like, if I did all these terrible things for the group must be awesome. The group might not be that great. But you convince yourself that if you've worked so hard, paid so much money to do this thing, you convince yourself it's a good time, it's worth it. Here's something else that we do to persuade people. And this is like, let's say you're trying to ask your parents for some money, right? The door in the face effect is the idea that like you knock on someone's door and you say, hey, will you donate $1,000 to the Boy Scouts? They slam the door in your face. So you go back the next day, you knock on the door and you say, hey, I know you didn't want to give $1,000 to the Boy Scouts, but how about $10? It's like in their brain, they're like, you know what, $10 is more reasonable. If you just knocked on the door and said, hey, will you give me $10? They would have been like, I don't know you. But because they already rejected you, they kind of feel bad about it. So when you come in with a more reasonable, smaller request, they go for it. In sales, they do this. It's called the highball procedure. They present something as like, you know, this normally costs $100, but for you today, only $9.99. They make it seem in your brain, it's the anchoring bias, that something was super expensive, and then they make it seem cheaper, more affordable, right? So with your parents, you ask for something big. Mom, can I have $100? They say no. I'm like, okay, how about 20? Sure, you can have 20. That's you using the door in the face effect. Another way to do this, they have found that if you first ask for something small and they say yes to it, so if you say, hey mom, could I talk to you for a couple minutes? That's a pretty small request. Your mom's going to say, yeah, sure, of course. Then you ask for something that requires a little bit more. You ask for something larger. Foot in the door goes back to sales, right? You're the Boy Scout. You're going door to door. You knock on the door. You say, hello, sir. Could I talk to you for a couple minutes? Well, yeah, sure. You're a Boy Scout. You can talk to them for a couple minutes. Say, well, you know, we're doing this initiative. We have this project. Would you mind signing my petition? Like, a signature is not going to cost them anything, so they sign your petition. Now you say, thank you so much for supporting us. Since you support us, your foot is in the door. It's like you're in with them. Since you have supported us by signing this, would you also be willing to give $10? In their brain, they're like, I guess I'm supporting this kid. I'm already on his team. Like, I should probably, you know, I need to do this thing for him. The foot is in the door. They agree to something small, signing your petition, talking to you for a couple minutes, and then when you ask for something larger later on, they're more likely to give that larger thing because they feel committed. They feel like they're on your team. They feel connected to you. In sales, they do a version that's called the lowball procedure, where they tell you like, oh, this thing's only $10. Then you're like, wow, what a great deal. It's such a low price. And then when you go to pay for it, they're like, oh yeah, but shipping and handling is $40, and there's also an annual subscription, and we're gonna need your credit card number, and don't worry, we'll charge you automatically. And it ends up costing you way more. Car dealerships do this. They make it sound like you're able to get your car for $18,000, but then when you get the tax and the title and the fees, and they want to throw in this warranty, and actually the version you want with the cruise control, it's gonna be an extra $4,000. They get you in the door, and then once you're in the door, they can kind of ask for more, and you'll do it because you're like, oh, I'm already there, I'm already committed. We're really bad at backing up, admitting we were wrong. The validity effect is another way that you can persuade people, convince them of things. The validity effect is the idea that the things that you hear repeatedly, if someone tells you something more and more often, you believe it. Even if it doesn't make sense, even if it's not true, but the more you hear it, the more your brain's like, ah, I've heard this before. It must have some meaning to it. There must be some truth behind it. A version of this for interacting with people is called, and write this phrase down, the mere, M-E-R-E, the mere exposure effect is the idea that when we're around somebody more, we eventually get to like them a little bit more. We get used to them. They are more familiar. And we'll talk about this when we talk about attraction in a week or two. Okay, how you can, you know, get people to fall in love with you. The more you're around them, the more they're going to like you. It's interesting. The last thing here is called the primacy effect. Primacy means the thing that came first. Okay, we talked about this with the serial position effect, right? The primacy and the recency effect. It's like, what did you hear first? What did you hear most recent? What did you hear last? The primacy effect is the idea that whatever you hear first, that's typically what you're going to think is true. It's like part of the anchoring bias almost, right? The price that you hear first, the thing you hear first, the fact, the opinion, your brain latches onto that idea and just like takes it for granted, assumes that it must be right if it's the first information you have about a new person, a new topic, a new idea. Primacy effect. What came first is what you're going to believe. So here's a little comic of Calvin Hobbes here. He says, Mom, can I set fire to my bed mattress? She says, no, Calvin. He says, Mom, can I ride my tricycle on the roof? She says, no, Calvin. Man, she is just slamming the door in his face. He says, Mom, can I have a cookie? She says, no, Calvin. And he says, she's on to me. Right? What's he doing? He's using the door in the face technique, right? He's purposefully asking for big, outrageous things with the hope that after these outrageous requests, she'll give in to a smaller, more reasonable request, right? These outrageous requests, these big requests, make the small thing seem more attainable, seem more reasonable. Did not work for Calvin, but I know that it has worked for you before, all right? Do a little check for understanding here. We'll look at this in class as well. Sorry about this being a little bit blurry. I'm using a different computer here because of some internet issues. But try and match the 8 scenarios on the left with the 8 terms on the right. This would be something cool. Questions like this could be on the quiz, could be on the test, all right? So make sure that you understand these concepts and that you can apply it to the scenarios and situations. Appreciate you all. See you later.